What is the true foundation of human power? When we think of the great architects of history, the masters of influence, and the icons who command the gaze of millions, we instinctively look upward. We look at their faces, their crowns, their gestures, and their words. But we rarely look down. We rarely examine the very ground they stand upon. Yet, history conceals a profound psychological secret. To conquer the world, one must first possess the literal ability to stand firmly upon it. In 1898, in a desperately impoverished village in southern Italy, a boy was born into absolute nothingness. He had no wealth, no pedigree, and no visible path to influence. Yet, he would grow up to control the steps, the posture, and the literal foundation of the global elite. He did not use magic, nor did he command armies. He used leather, an obsessive understanding of human anatomy, and an unbreakable psychological will. This is the story of the hidden architecture of power. This is the psychological alchemy of how a poor Italian boy created the empire of Salvatore Ferragamo. Poverty is rarely understood for what it truly is. It is not merely a lack of physical resources. It is a brutal psychological crucible. Poverty creates a vacuum. In the architecture of the human mind, a vacuum is unnatural. It demands to be filled. For young Salvatore, born as the 11th of 14 children in the tiny, sun-baked agricultural town of Bonito, the vacuum was deafening. In a family of that immense size, struggling daily merely to survive, individuality is practically erased. You are not viewed as a unique entity. You are a mouth to feed, a small cog in a desperate, collective survival mechanism. But the human ego, the inner drive of a true visionary, fiercely rebels against this anonymity. At the fragile age of 9, a profound psychological dilemma presented itself, one that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his life. His sisters were preparing to receive their first communion, a rite of passage that held immense spiritual and social weight in traditional Italian culture. But the family was completely destitute. They could not afford the traditional white shoes required for the ceremony. The tears of his sisters were not just expressions of sorrow, they were the catalyst for an alchemical transformation. In the mind of young Salvatore, their shame became his ultimate motivation. He made a decision that defied the strict social hierarchies of his time. He went to the local cobbler to borrow tools and scraps of material. In the late 19th century, the shoemaker was considered one of the lowest of the low in the social strata. Touching the feet, working with dirt, animal hides, and the ground was the work of peasants. But ancient Hermetic wisdom teaches us a fundamental truth: as above, so below. The foundation of the highest and most magnificent tower must rest deeply in the dark, unseen dirt. Salvatore stayed awake through the entire night. In those quiet, desperate hours, he wasn't just stitching pieces of scrap canvas and cardboard, he was forging his own identity. By morning, he had created his first pair of shoes. They were beautiful, functional, and deeply symbolic. The psychology here is pivotal to understanding the minds of those who shape history. He did not accept the reality of his poverty. He manipulated raw, physical matter to alter his reality. He took control. This is the first defining trait of a master: the absolute refusal to be a victim of circumstance, and the obsessive drive to reshape the material world to match the vision within their mind. He took the shame of his family and transmuted it into triumph. But to grow, a seed must eventually leave the barren soil. By his teenage years, the limits of Bonito could no longer contain his ambition. The migration of Salvatore to America was not just a geographic relocation, it was a leap into the modern pantheon. He arrived in Boston, where one of his brothers worked in a massive, modern shoe factory. Here, Salvatore encountered the roaring engine of the Industrial Revolution. He saw machines stamping out thousands of identical shoes for the masses, a marvel of modern efficiency. Yet it was here that he made his second profound psychological choice. He rejected the machine. Why? Because mass production is the death of the individual. True power, true influence, and true mastery lie in the unique, the tailored, the specific. He understood a hidden psychological truth about human nature, particularly the nature of the elite. The powerful do not want what everyone else has. They crave what is made exclusively for them, something that acknowledges their unique existence in the world. The assembly line erased the soul of the artisan, and Ferragamo refused to surrender his soul to the iron gears of conformity. He packed his bags and moved across the continent to California, eventually settling in the burgeoning dreamscape of Hollywood. In the 1920s, Hollywood was becoming the Mount Olympus of the 20th century. The actors and actresses were the new gods and goddesses, projected larger than life onto silver screens, worshipped by millions in the dark temples of movie theaters. Yet, beneath the glamour, these modern gods were profoundly flawed, deeply insecure mortals. They were desperate for validation, terrified of losing their status, and quite literally, in intense physical pain. Ferragamo realized something extraordinary as he observed these cinematic icons. He realized that the beautiful shoes of the era, the ones adorned with jewels and exotic leathers, were causing crippling agony. He asked himself a question that shifted his destiny from being a mere craftsman to an architect of the human form. Why do shoes that look so beautiful cause so much pain? Instead of merely tweaking the external design, he took a radical step. He enrolled in the University of Southern California to study human anatomy, mathematics, and chemical engineering. Think about the depth of this obsession. A shoemaker sitting in university lecture halls, studying the skeletal structure of the human body, the distribution of weight, and the mechanics of bone and muscle. He was no longer just making fashion. He was searching for the hidden mechanics of human balance. It was through this intense study that he discovered the secret of the arch. He learned that when a human being stands, when their entire body weight drops straight down into the arch of the foot, acting exactly like a plumb line in classical architecture. Metaphorically and literally, if the arch is unsupported, the entire structure of the human being falters. The posture collapses, the spine curves, the physical pain drains the mind, and the aura of power diminishes. Ferragamo invented a revolutionary steel shank to slide inside the sole of the shoe, providing absolute support to the arch. He was engineering human confidence. Think about the psychological impact of this innovation. When a person stands perfectly balanced, completely free of pain, their psychological state instantly alters. They feel rooted, grounded, and undeniably powerful. Ferragamo became the master of this foundation. The biggest stars of the era, Greta Garbo, Marilyn Monroe, Audrey Hepburn, Judy Garland, flocked to his shop. They literally could not stand in their full power without his unseen support. The poor boy from Bonito was now dictating the posture of the world's most idolized figures. He had become the man who held up the gods. To understand the true nature of what Ferragamo achieved, we must understand the profound symbolism of the foot throughout human history. The foot has always been a symbol of subjugation, vulnerability, and extreme reverence. We bow at the feet of royalty, we kiss the ring of the Pope, but the ultimate act of humility is the washing of the feet. The foot is the anchor that connects the divine, aspirational human mind to the crude, earthly realm. Ferragamo instinctively understood this hidden dynamic of power. When a Hollywood star or a wealthy aristocrat entered his shop, the traditional dynamic of power completely inverted. The millionaire, the global icon, the untouchable star had to sit down, take off their shoes, and present their bare, vulnerable feet to the artisan. In that intimate moment, stripped of their cinematic glamour and social armor, Ferragamo saw the absolute truth of the person. He famously stated that he could read a person's character, their hidden desires, and their deepest insecurities simply by examining their feet. He categorized his elite clients into 3 distinct psychological profiles: the Cinderella, the aristocrat, and the Venus. He wasn't just measuring physical dimensions, he was profiling their psychology. The Venus foot belonged to women of great beauty and elegance, yet deeply grounded and practical. The aristocrat foot belonged to those who were highly sensitive and refined, but often fragile, requiring immense understanding and delicate handling. The Cinderella foot belonged to those who loved the illusion, the dreamers who wanted to be transformed by the magic of the shoe. He gave them exactly what their psychology demanded. He wasn't selling them leather and silk, he was selling them an extension of their deepest psychological identity. By understanding their foundation, he controlled their confidence. They became dependent on him. This is the ultimate quiet power of the master artisan. But the path of power, much like the Hermetic principle of rhythm, is never a straight, upward line. It is a pendulum. It is a continuous cycle of death and rebirth. In 1927, seeking to merge his profound understanding of American business with the unmatched mastery of Italian craftsmanship, Ferragamo returned to Italy. He chose Florence, the eternal city of the Renaissance, the home of the Medici, a city built on the alchemy of art and power. He established a massive workshop, employing hundreds of artisans. He was at the absolute peak of his power. But then, the pendulum swung back with violent force. The global economic collapse of the Great Depression swept across the world, destroying markets, credit, and fortunes. Compounded by the mismanagement of his business partners and the sudden halt of international trade, the unthinkable happened. In 1933, Salvatore Ferragamo, the shoemaker to the stars, the man who had built an empire from nothing, went completely bankrupt. He lost it all. I imagine the psychological devastation of that moment. To have climbed from the starving streets of Bonito to the absolute peak of Hollywood's Mount Olympus, only to be cast down into the abyss of total ruin. This is the moment where most men break. This is where the ego shatters and the individual accepts defeat, fading into the obscurity of history. But the mind that has mastered the alchemy of transformation reacts differently to the abyss. A true visionary sees bankruptcy not as a final death, but as a necessary shedding of dead skin. The foundation he had built inside his own mind was supported by the steel shank of his own resilience. He did not panic. He did not surrender. He systematically began to rebuild, step by step, relying solely on his reputation, his absolute mastery of his craft, and his unbreakable will. He resurrected his company from the ashes, but the universe had one more brutal test for the master. As he rebuilt his empire, the dark shadow of World War II fell over Europe. Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy led to severe international economic sanctions. The nation was plunged into an era of autarky, forced self-sufficiency. For Ferragamo, this meant a sudden and absolute deprivation of his most essential materials. There was no high-quality leather to be found. There was no steel to forge his famous arch supports. Restriction is the ultimate unyielding test of the visionary mind. When faced with scarcity, the average human mind contracts. It complains, it makes excuses, and it halts production. But Ferragamo's mind expanded. While others lamented what they lacked, Ferragamo intensely observed what he had. He looked at the everyday objects around him. He looked at the cork from wine bottles. To anyone else, a piece of cork was a disposable, fragile afterthought. But Ferragamo saw a material that was incredibly light, durable, and capable of holding form. He took this overlooked, common material, carved it, shaped it, and created the legendary wedge heel. Because he couldn't use steel to bridge the gap between the heel and the ball of the foot, he filled the entire space with cork. The cork wedge was not just a shoe, it was an instant global phenomenon. It was a masterpiece born entirely from deprivation, echoing the very first pair of shoes he made for his sister out of scraps. When he ran out of thread and leather, so he observed fishermen using transparent nylon lines to catch fish in the Arno River. He took that invisible industrial thread and wove it into the upper part of the shoe, creating the famous invisible shoe. It gave the breathtaking illusion that the wearer's foot was magically floating in the air, adorned only by a floating heel. This period of his life reveals one of the most profound lessons of human behavior and the history of power. The greatest innovations, the most immortal creations, do not come from a place of abundance. They come from the psychological refusal to be limited by scarcity. Ferragamo turned the invisible constraints of war, dictatorship, and economic collapse into the visible, tangible manifestation of genius. He proved that true power does not reside in the materials you possess, but in the mind that commands them. Salvatore Ferragamo passed away in 1960, but he left behind an empire that transcends mere fashion. His life is not a story about shoes. It is a profound masterclass in the hidden mechanics of human elevation, resilience, and psychological alchemy. He taught us that true power does not begin in the crown upon the head. It begins in the soles of the feet. It begins in the dark, in the dirt, in the unglamorous areas we so often neglect. He showed us that the artisan who masters the foundation holds the strings to the gods themselves. By understanding the pain, the insecurity, and the physical reality of the human condition, he was able to engineer confidence, posture, and presence. When you look at your own life through the lens of this ancient hidden wisdom, well, you must ask yourself, what is your foundation? Are you walking upon the fragile, mass-produced expectations of a society that wishes to keep you uniform and compliant? Or have you done the agonizing, meticulous work to engineer your own support? The poor Italian boy from Bonito didn't just make footwear. He engineered the very posture of modern power. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that no matter how destitute your beginnings, no matter how profound the void you are born into, if you relentlessly study the anatomy of human nature, and if you absolutely refuse to let the world dictate your limits, you can force the world to walk to the rhythm of your own design. Remember this truth, hidden in plain sight. The ground you walk upon is entirely indifferent to your presence. It is your steps and the foundation you build beneath them that must command its respect.